Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining first thing after lunch. So I'll just quickly introduce myself. My name is Thomas Cooper. I'm a principal software developer at Royal Bank of Canada. We're a global financial institution based in Toronto. And today I'll just be talking to you about the FINOS project GitProxy and how it's enabling RBC and others to contribute to open source in financial services. So just to sort of level set, and this is probably no surprise to anybody in this room, but the reality is that open source it's everywhere, it's ubiquitous and prevalent, across the industry. It is sort of the dominant factor in software development today. Anywhere from 90% of our software that's running in production is made up of open source code that includes our programming languages, our database engines, et cetera. Again, probably no surprise to anybody here. Somewhere north of 6 trillion packages were downloaded in the year 2024. And there are millions of open source projects that are in play today, publishing tens of millions of unique versions. It truly is sort of like a global phenomenon, and it operates at a scale that's sort of well beyond one financial institution. Obviously, this sort of lends itself to difficulties when it comes to security. So managing the risk of open source software, security vulnerabilities, et cetera. It's sort of an open challenge and something that all of our institutions are trying to grapple with. That Log4j vulnerability, it's a perfect example, really sort of kickstarted a lot of the scrutiny over managing the security of our supply chain. And with new government directives, new legislation coming down, this problem is only going to continue to grow and become more of an issue. And so really just what this means for us in financial services is that open source is really at the heart of all of our production systems. It's not necessarily something that we can sort of just manage as a third-party asset or concern. It's something that's sort of deeply embedded with our everyday life. And so it's an imperative for us to be able to sort of harness sort of our scale and our internal resources, and that means contributing to open source projects ultimately. But there are a number of challenges, right? Financial institutions, we have lots of regulatory requirements. There's lots of scrutiny. Compliance is obviously a big issue. And, when you're working with a public open source project, your sensitivity around data and leaking internal information is very high. If you're sort of free to sort of work in a public domain, you run the risk of sort of publishing internal details and struggling to sort of manage your internal system controls versus the opportunity that you get with working with an open source project. So, security is obviously paramount for us. Legal and IP concerns. So, a lot of us have sort of extensive patent portfolios. There's a sort of natural tension between an open source license that might be sort of free or copyleft versus sort of the patent rights that we all sort of take for, keep with our own intellectual property. So it's a concern. And then just sort of from a process and practice and culture standpoint, there's a sort of traditional sort of build versus buy mentality, working with procurement teams. It can be sort of difficult to approach those conversations when there's actually some software that's sitting in a more public domain. And so you want to be able to sort of leverage those as well, but still sort of effectively you just want to ensure that you're managing those risks from just a supply chain standpoint. And then internally, of course, like our practices around release management, code review, approval, sign-off can really conflict with sort of the more open, transparent way that an open source project is maintained. And then, risk to reputation and brand. The act of working in the public domain means that you just have to be cognizant of, how it presents your institution and that, you're sort of following best practices and procedures. So all this is just a level set. Again, no surprise to anybody here, but GitProxy really is meant to help to facilitate the egress of code outside of your organization. So it allows you to centrally sort of govern in a sort of internal networking standpoint the ability to have code be reviewed and audited ahead of time. It allows you to have one central egress point where you can point your security team, your compliance teams, and sort of really shore up your own internal requirements such that you'll be able to implement your own custom checks, logic, etc. GitProxy is also highly customizable and configurable, so if you have your own internal requirements, internal documentation that you want to sort of link to, guide your development teams to, it's very extensible in that manner. And because it is a proxy server, it is a server that runs on your corporate environment, and it speaks over the Git protocol. It's really agnostic to any Git provider, so it doesn't really necessarily matter where an open source project may be hosted. It could be on sort of a popular hosting provider like GitHub or GitLab. It also could be on a self-hosted Git repository server. GitProxy can interact with it because it is sort of ultimately implementing Git at that layer. Just to sort of briefly sort of show you the architecture. So your development teams, which are very familiar with interacting with Git, will be pushing code to a Git server. GitProxy will be able to receive that push request. It will do a local checkout, and that local checkout is really our opportunity to vet that code, make sure that any unwanted content is sort of scanned for, you might have certain requirements around internal system details that you want to sort of filter out, or you want to ensure that attribution to those commits are properly signed to your organization. So GitProxy allows you to run through those series of checks on a local checkout. The sort of dashboard and web API component is there to manage pushes that are received from GitProxy. So when a push comes into the server, ultimately there's a sort of a second step where development teams or release managers can sort of view the code, view the pushes as they're coming through, and sort of choose to approve or reject it kind of on the merits. So there's an opportunity for sort of code to be vetted and audited before it actually leaves your organization. If there's any of the automated checks that are sort of rejected, developers get like a helpful error message back to their Git client. So again, it's very familiar to your development teams. And assuming that sort of those automated checks have passed and your approvers have approved the change to actually go through, developers would push again, and then it actually ends up on the public Git repository at that point. Sort of from the RBC side, some of our sort of main contributions to the project was the ability to extend GitProxy. So we have a plugin system where you can author sort of standard NPM packages, and that allows you to customize the behavior of GitProxy for your own unique requirements. If there's core features missing, you can sort of extend it naturally using sort of NPM packages to do that. And of course, everything is sort of saved into an external database, so it's very auditable. You can pull activity reports, et cetera. And this is just to sort of show you a little bit of it in action. So again, assuming those automated checks have passed, once a Git push is received, you have sort of an opportunity to sort of view the content of that push and sort of audit it at that point as well. You can get sort of a helpful diff of the code, again, outside of sort of the Git flow. And then from your development teams, they just simply have a sort of a helpful feedback and error message that they can interact with GitProxy at this point. So how GitProxy is actually helping, as I said, it's sort of this centralized point where code can egress your corporate environment. It allows you to sort of implement that in sort of a technology agnostic way. It is just a reverse proxy at the end of the day, so it's very sort of simple to get sort of firewall rules in place and get your compliance and security teams to review that deployment. It's also using Git at the end of the day, so those same Git clients that your developers are using will work with GitProxy. It also supports any Git repo, so this doesn't necessarily have to be a public upstream open source project. We actually have a deployment already that is using sort of from private to private repositories, and again, just having that sort of that in-between layer where you can implement push protections. It allows you to sort of intercept it before it actually lands on a remote repo, which is very useful for our purposes. And then I just want to sort of talk briefly about our contributor community. So, again, we're at FINOS. We love our contributor community. I just want to sort of say that like RBC is very privileged to be part of the maintainer group now. And so we've had sort of multiple contributions, both from RBC and others, other FINOS members, sort of major features and enhancements and refactors. We have multiple production deployments at this time, so both at RBC and City and soon to be, or already is, at NatWest and others. So this is software running in production. And, and as was announced in the keynote as well, we're actually at active status. So this is no longer just an incubating project. You can sort of reliably deploy this in your own environment and implement this as part of your open source contribution process. And we're sort of rapidly iterating towards 2.x. So, over the last 2 years, we've had a ton of momentum, a lot of sort of new contributors that have been onboarded into the project. And so we're sort of continuing to build up that feature set. And then just to go over sort of how RBC is leveraging this. So we're at the end of the day, it's still using GitProxy for its core functionality of intercepting pushes before it egresses the corporate environment. Some key differences is that we do whitelisting in an externalized onboarding system that allows us to set up our own internal forks so developers can contribute code in a sort of safe environment within the corporate network. We can do things like scan code ahead of time, make sure that the licenses being used sort of fall within our open source program office policy. And we sort of do that in the form of that extensibility, those plugins. So that's what we're using today. And we have a sort of a GitHub app that interacts with our internal GitHub Enterprise environment. Again, this is all sort of integrated from GitProxy from the plugin layer, so we're able to leverage the core Git proxying, reverse proxying, and sort of transport layer, but still have like our own business logic incorporated into our unique deployment. And then just a sort of a sneak peek as to what this looks like. So again, we do our own internal pull request sort of review process before code actually egresses our environment. So we have an opportunity to catch things before it actually leaves our corporate environment. And we've sort of just been able to extend the behavior of GitProxy directly. You can kind of see in that sort of error message, it's very unique to our organization, but this is sort of well within the realms of possibility for yourself as well. And lastly, I just want to end on just sort of some of the roadmap and some of the opportunities that we're looking to sort of evolve GitProxy to. So we want to just sort of expand the core feature set, so incorporating things like SSH support, expanding our authorization, authentication support, OIDC being a very popular sort of authentication method, so it makes it more easy to integrate in your environment. Continuing to have ongoing performance tweaks, sort of dealing with some of the sharper edges around how the Git workflow actually works. So being able to handle things like tag releases or force pushes and rebasing. There's a little bit of complexity to handle on the wire, so we're sort of continuing to invest in that core feature set. We also want to enable participation to open source projects. So it's not just about sort of the Git pushes and your branches and the code commits that you want to contribute to an open source project. There's a lot of activity that happens around reporting issues, commenting on pull requests and merge requests. So that ability to engage with the community, but do so safely, and to have, again, that auditability or that sort of layer in between. And then just some ideas for the future, things that we're looking to consider. How do we get sort of deep activity logs and analytics out of our open source contributors in our corporate environment, so we can sort of be able to just get like user data as well. There are sort of your common compliance requirements around employee messaging and sort of content leaving your organization. So being able to extend GitProxy to support those use cases, plug it into your compliance systems, that's something that we're thinking about as well. And as well, just some sort of production data observability, that sort of thing, to make it more robust. We also want to extract some of the configurability that GitProxy has built in to the project today. So being able to externalize some of those policy-based configurations. How do we integrate with like an external policy engine such as Open Policy Agent? And then just some sort of fun things. Again, these are some of the harder things around how you interact with a GitHub or sorry, a Git repository. Things like how do we ensure like DCO and commits are signed before they leave? Can we centralize maybe the commit signing activity itself so it's not such a burden on developers and be able to just sort of insert that in transit? How can we automatically like redact internal information? It's things like this that we're exploring. And then lastly, just outside of the server-based model of contributing to open source, the Linux kernel being a sort of a primary example here, how do we support contributions that might be sort of patch-based or asynchronous? So we're trying to sort of position GitProxy as a platform to enable contribution in general. And as well, I'll just end before I hand it off to David, and he'll sort of walk you through their experience at G Research with GitProxy. And I'll leave these links on the slide as well. We're really sort of evolving GitProxy to be just a generic platform for implementing custom push protections. So as I mentioned before, GitProxy is agnostic of the remote Git repository. So this could be from private to private or from a private to public, which is typically with open source contribution, but it's not necessarily just for open source. That's obviously the main sort of use case that we're supporting. So if you want to learn more, we're on GitHub. We're a FINOS project. You can reach us there. And as was mentioned this morning as well, there's a new case study that NatWest, City, and RBC has contributed to, just sort of sharing our experience, how we position GitProxy, and sort of how it matters to our organization. And with that, I'll hand it off to David.
Just bear with me for a second. So that works. Awesome. Thank you for having me, and thank you, Thomas, for the excellent introduction to GitProxy. And now I'd just like to go over kind of our take on it. My name is Dávid Serfőző, but you can call me David. The accents just get in the way. I'm a software engineer at G Research in the platform engineering organization, and I've been with the company for a bit over 4 years now in various teams. But earlier in my life, I also spent considerable time in an investment bank, so I kind of have some idea about the challenges around open source in these institutions. Just very quickly, for those of you who are not familiar with G Research, a quick intro to what we do, who we are. So we are a quantitative research and technology firm based in London and Dallas. We kind of use machine learning and big data and other emerging tech to predict movements in financial markets. And most importantly, we play a very active role in the open source community, usually mostly around data science and machine learning tools, just by the nature of the business. And if you want to learn a bit more about us, here's a QR code, yet another one. Just takes you to our website. So first, get a bit on the kind of state of OSS at G Research. So I can kind of show the motivations for us to use GitProxy. Obviously, as Thomas also mentioned, using open source in this day and age is not really a question. You kind of have to do it, and this is no different for us either. It kind of plays a vital role in our tech landscape. We're using a number of CNCF, Apache, and other projects, various libraries, tools. G Research also has some of its own projects, some that we maintain, some that we've been developed and contributed back to the community. Notable examples would be FastTrackML or Consul.net, and for example, the Armada project, the latter of which is a multi-Kubernetes cluster batch job scheduler, basically. There were multiple public talks about this in the past, so if you're interested, you can look those up. You can also find us on GitHub. And more importantly, we also have an open source program office, which consists of about 30 full-time engineers, so it's quite big. And they work with our internal teams to kind of sort out internal open source software needs, and then engage with the community, implement those, get them merged. We also sometimes kind of adopt abandoned projects that we use. As far as I know, At some point, we also had people we hired, were maintainers of open source projects we use. So again, we're quite active in this space. In terms of the experience you get when you're working with open source tech in G research, as I would imagine, true for most of you, in financial services, we usually have very restrictive environments with strict ingress, egress controls, which kind of creates a lot of friction when you want to bring in or especially go out to the internet. And this is no different for us. We historically have been very security conscious. We really want to have a very good control and idea of what kind of software we bring in, how it gets used. And we especially want to be very, very careful about what leaves our network. As I would imagine in this business, it's probably true for most of us. So we have a few things already in place that we kind of use to help using open source software within a company to bring it in. I'd imagine most of you have similar things. So we have a history of having multiple iterations of pull-through proxies where we have a preset, pre-approved list of repos we can just directly pull in via an HTTP proxy. It's nowadays very easy to implement. Any reverse proxy will give you enough functionality to do this. And we also have something where we have a way to, again, for pre-selected approved list of repos, we can sync in the external repos for, let's say, github.com, our internal source control system, which is GitHub Enterprise. So it is kind of similar. And then this enables us to have an internal fork. And then if we have to modify open source software or fix bugs, we can quickly iterate on it. It just makes our lives a lot easier. However, contributing whatever changes we make inside is really a bit of a cumbersome process. And we do have processes to do this. These are usually very rigid, high friction, and very often it is something that people just skip because it is problematic. So this is where having a dedicated OSS team or OSPO helps a lot, as they can kind of do these contributions. But there are quite a few occasions when somebody who's actually operating the technology or using a certain library is in a better position to kind of introduce fixes or new features. It just makes it a lot easier. But however, because it's so problematic to do this, you kind of lose the contributions of those people, which again, our OSPO is relatively big, with 30 people, as I mentioned, but we also have hundreds of very smart engineers who you're kind of losing with not having an easy way to do these contributions. Just a quick example of one of the things you could do to do contributions as an internal engineer, and these are all the steps you kind of have to go through with like juggling the internal fork and the fork of an internal fork, and an automated sync service and all these approvals. And then obviously this takes a lot of steps, a lot of human interactions. These steps are not necessarily happening instantaneously, so you might have to wait a lot. And then imagine having to go through this when somebody in the open source community comments on your PR and requests a change. Now you're back to doing it the whole thing again. So it kind of discourages people from doing this. And this is why we're kind of looking at GitProxy at the moment. And we really hope that it's going to help us ease and make this process a bit quicker. Now, we're at kind of the beginning of our journey with GitProxy. We looked at it, we had multiple discussions, and we kind of identified a few, I should say, requirement gaps that we really like to address. And this is where our open source team comes in, and they started contributing certain features I'm going to go over in a sec, and why we kind of really like to have those. As of now, I think we also have 2 people from our OSPO added as maintainers on the project, so I'm really hoping this process becomes a bit quicker after this. So the first thing I'd like to mention is how you authenticate to Git when you're using a Git client, you're trying to push things. Now, I would like to mention that, again, internally we use GitHub Enterprise, and we have custom tooling around this, which I don't really want to get into details, but basically it gives us a very seamless way to set up authentication towards an internal source control, and we really like to keep this experience for our users, so not to introduce yet another way of like having set up SSH keys or having set up paths or whatnot. So Unfortunately, the automation we use for the internal source control is not really something you can port to github.com, for example. So we discussed kind of options around this. There are two approaches that we kind of see. One of them is using OAuth tokens, which github.com supports. However, it might be different in other platforms. And the other approach is adding SSH support, as Thomas also brought it up in his talk, to GitProxy itself. So my hope with this is that we can create some similar automation that automates setting up of the SSH keys for authenticated users, and give you a kind of a similar experience. So this is, I think, it's almost ready. There's a PR in the repo, I believe, but it took a while to get to this point with this one. The other thing is, as you saw from Thomas's talk, the normal process is that you kind of push to GitProxy, it gets into the staging area, and then somebody actually has to go in and review your changes, approve it, and then it can go to the public repo. Now, we believe that, at least in some of our use cases, we could actually use something to like automate these checks, so this process becomes as transparent as possible for our end users. And again, internally, we have some tricks. In GitHub Enterprise, you can do pre-receive hooks, which is not a thing on github.com. So we decided to add a similar feature to GitProxy itself that basically allows you to define these kind of pre-receive hooks and auto-reject, approve certain pushed changes. Yeah, I think, I'm not sure if there's a PR for that yet, but, or it might have been, yeah, it's in progress. And then last but not least, we really like to automate things. So automating the deployments, the managing users, configuration, as much as possible. So one of the outcomes is this: we do use OIDC for pretty much everything where we can. So we have added OIDC authentication to both the GUI and the REST API of GitProxy. This enables us to kind of better interact with non-human accounts and those kind of things. So it enables us to automate user provisioning and management. And also the other thing, which again, I'm not 100% sure if merged yet, but we did add the support for external configuration. So you don't have to deploy your config with the service itself. And it also allows you to reload the config at runtime without restarting the service. This is kind of important if you kind of think about having a GitOpsy set up for configuration, which we often do, and so those are the motivations behind it. So we really hope that with these changes we can get to a POC state and then evaluate whether this fits our needs or not, and hopefully it does. And then I would imagine there might be other contributions that we're going to do in the future, but this is where we're at the moment. So that is all of it. Thank you very much, and I think we open for questions if you have any. Yeah.
So I think if there's any questions of the audience, if you could come up so we can sort of hear it through the microphone, and then we'll answer it. Are there any questions in the room? Going once, going twice. Okay, great. If you folks do have any sort of follow-up or just like to sort of chat, we'll be here after the talk. But thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.